Well, it was supposed to be a referendum, but a referendum on what? Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, this week there were elections around the country in various statewide and local races, and you may have seen some headlines, if you're following the news, indicating that those elections portended one thing or another, and you certainly saw those headlines before the elections happened. But I've got kind of a grab bag of information about the election night results out of the New York Times, and at first, as I started reading it, it seemed to be indicating that there was some sort of a negative implication for those elections for President Trump. But as you read deeper into the story, it seemed like much more of a mixed bag. So I just kind of like to go through some of these results and kind of pick and choose and see what your initial inclination is to basically, is there a meaning in this? Is there no meaning in this? Should we completely ignore it? Should we be worried? Should we get aggressive when it comes to 2020, or all of the above? So here it is. In Kentucky, probably the most closely watched race across the nation, perhaps because of its incendiary governor, Matt Bevin. The Kentucky Kentucky gubernatorial race seems to have gone to Matt Bevin's Democratic challenger, who's actually the son of a former governor of Kentucky. And Bevin, at this point, as we record this, has not yet conceded the race. However, so Bevin loses right after Trump came in and did a rally with Bevin. Bevin had claimed that he was up big time, but apparently polls showed that the race was much closer than that. Bill, at first blush, you look at this and say, well, President Trump couldn't rescue one of his GOP cronies. On the other hand, Republicans won every other statewide race, including electing the first Republican attorney general in 70 years, who happens to be the first ever attorney general in the state of Kentucky, who's an African American. Is there anything at all that you can make of this?
Well, obviously, Bevin's name has been bandied around a lot, and not pleasantly. I think to just predicate this whole discussion today, I think on some level, anytime we talk about something like this, we're talking about the 2018 election. Donald Trump is
You mean 20?
No, 18.
Oh.
Donald Trump is a force unto himself, and he has a constituency that is not uniquely his, but certainly is a unique group of people. And if Donald Trump's not on the ballot, then I don't read a whole lot of portents one way or another into any election results that he's not directly involved with.
Well, he did get involved in this one, but I'll acknowledge, Bill, when he came into town to endorse Matt Bevin, Trump's words, not mine, he endorsed Governor Matt Bevin as a real pain in the ass, and basically said that Bevin was constantly coming to him asking for more money for his people in Kentucky, and Trump would repeatedly say, well, that's what you want him to do, but he's a pain in the ass. Okay.
Well, I think that gives you some idea of the general mood about Bevin. But again, I think it's reasonable to say that Trump really doesn't have any coattails for two reasons. First of all, most establishment Republicans don't particularly want to be on Trump's coattails. They still have this idea that somehow this is a fluke and an aberration, and that the real Republicans, want a little more decorum when they get whipped at the polls. And so I don't think Trump has coattails for another reason, and that is because his character and his personality are obviously a big part of this, but his mission is different than the mission of any other politician in the country. Every other politician, including the governor of Kentucky, is elected by people who expect this person to go to Kentucky and govern Kentucky. But that's not what Trump's sent to Washington for. His job is to destroy things. And I mean that in the best possible way, destroy these calcified structures that have been there forever and are no longer, not just obsolete, but downright treasonous now. So the fact that we lost one close enough for it still to be up in the air and won everything else is hardly an indictment of Trump's electability going forward, in my opinion.
Well, the apparent governor-elect of Kentucky, Andy Beshear, took an interesting approach to this. And to your point, he really focused during the course of this race on Matt Bevin, the sitting governor. He distanced himself from national Democrats, and he avoided questions about the Trump impeachment hearings. And he really tried to focus in on Matt Bevin's controversial remarks, on his efforts to cut Medicaid, on his efforts to reform the state pension plan. Now, he's across the country, there were different approaches taken. Some Republicans ran trying to find the Trump coattails. Some Democrats ran against Trump. But then you have the opposite, where Republicans just ran away from Trump and Democrats avoided it like Andy Beshear did.
Can I interrupt?
Yeah, please.
That is a data point. The fact that Trump's not on the ballot, I don't think affects much in terms of the way or the number of people that came out to vote for Bevin. If Trump's not on the ticket, there's a lot of people not going to show up. We saw that in 2018. It'd be very interesting to see what happens in 2020. But the fact that the Democrat looks like he won this election by specifically avoiding impeachment and specifically avoiding the farthest of these progressive Democratic parties, platforms and policies, is an indication that indeed seems to me to be the reason he got elected. If he'd gone full woke, I don't think he would have had a chance. So what that tells me is that there is a Democratic strategy for victory in 2020, but they don't have anybody who can do it, and they don't have any desire to do it, and they don't know how to do it. But other than that, yes, there is a quantum possibility that somebody in the Democratic Party will arise and understand that the American people are not interested in impeaching Donald Trump. They're interested in many things, among them security, which Trump is pretty good with, the economy, which Trump has been spectacular with. And so I find it an interesting data point that this one case of the Democrat winning was a case where he distanced himself from the kind of bizarre far left tilt of the Democratic Party in general, and specifically refused to go into this impeachment thing, because I'm sure he's savvy enough to realize it is a big, big political negative, and that is good news for Republicans.
Now, the New York Times, in its a little piece of analysis or commentary pretty far down in this story, said that these races across the country reflected the country's increasingly contentious politics and the widening rural and urban divide. And let me just give you a quick roundup of some of the other results. For example, Republican Tate Reeves won the Alabama gubernatorial race, beating the Democrat there. Virginia's State House, for the first time since 1993, now has a majority in the Assembly and in the executive office that are Democrats, even in a year in which the governor and the lieutenant governor were almost thrown out of office. Some of you may remember Ralph Northam's incident regarding a past blackface party picture. Democrats, this was interesting, I thought, juxtaposition. New Jersey and Pennsylvania. New Jersey Republicans appear poised to pick up 2 seats in the Assembly and 1 in the state Senate. These would be the first legislative gains for Republicans in New Jersey in almost a decade, and a large part of that surge came from southern New Jersey that Trump took very strongly, or where Trump performed very strongly in 2016. And then finally, Pennsylvania Democrats. I thought this was interesting that the New York Times even included this, because most of it was statewide news. Pennsylvania Democrats are about to gain control of a handful of local governments in Philadelphia's so-called collar counties. Bill, do these kind of results really reflect some sort of growing political divide, or is it just the old axiom that all politics is local?
Well, it's that, and I think probably if you want to take a kind of a big picture view of this, Scott, what you're reporting is that there was no particularly dramatic move either way. The Republicans didn't sweep all the Democrats out of office across the country, and the inverse didn't happen. But that also tells you something. If this was more or less, if you want to just take it, this is how it sounds to me coming from you. If this were more or less a pretty unexciting, pretty uninformative election, where Democrats did well in some places, Republicans did well in some other places, that doesn't tell us much in terms of positive information, but it can exclude some things. And one thing it does exclude is this idea that the Democrats have constantly held on to, that Trump is spectacularly unpopular. And not only do the Democrats want him out of office, but most Republicans do too. We clearly didn't see that during this election. And if Trump's New Jersey support, which is really about the only example that you gave that can kind of correlate directly with the 2020 election, only because it's a fairly localized area and we have some data on that. If that's really the only sort of relatively well-defined information or data that we can get out of this election, then that seems to bode pretty well for Donald Trump in 2020.
And anybody who knows anything about the Philadelphia collar counties knows that there's one thing about Democrats in those suburban counties, and that is about half of them are registered as Republicans. And that's, I'm just being facetious there, but if you're part of, as I was, of the state Republican committee a few years back, it's like a whole different party. Those people from the urban and suburban areas around Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. Bill, I want to deal with finally a kind of a broader question when it comes to these statewide and local races. And this is specifically how it affects the structure of our Constitution that really had multiple layers of government to protect the rights of the individual. What happens and what's the risk to the Republic when you see local and statewide races being so tightly linked to who the president of the United States is, or frankly, to who is sitting in Congress? Do you think that this is just a natural evolution of a country that was once a bunch of countries and has now become one nation under God and sees itself as indivisible? Or do you think this is a threat to the very structure of the Constitution when these locals and statewide races are being tied so closely to the president of the United States, whoever he is?
There would be only one part of that would worry me, and it's not happening. The only part of that would worry me, it has happened certainly, would be if we were seeing legislation that removed power from local authorities, moved it up to the state, removed power from state authorities and moved it up to the federal government. If we were seeing a shift in the actual structure, the legal structure of how the government is set up, that would concern me.
Well, some might argue that that's exactly what happens when you have federal programs that are administered at the state and local level. And so the state and local governments are dependent upon the federal government's largesse, drawing not only their income from the U.S. Treasury, but their guidelines from U.S. regulatory structure.
That is a very sustainable argument. It's a very good argument, and I think there's no question about it. I think there's no question that this distributing of candy on the part of the federal government and then down to the states who distribute it down to the local level does affect on some level local politics with regard to who's in charge on the national level. But as long as there's a legal distinction, if you're saying, am I worried that people in counties are tend to vote the way that their party is voting on a national level, then I'm not worried about that at all. That's the will of the people. And as long as the will of the people is not being restricted or infringed in any way and not being manipulated by things like, the Commerce Clause is a great example. All of these legal, complications of what are pretty simple laws. I have to tell you, I think if I had the ability to add a constitutional amendment, first thing I'd do is repeal the 17th Amendment. But then if I had another one, I'd repeal the 16th Amendment. But if I had a third one, I would basically do away with gerrymandering. I find gerrymandering to be I find gerrymandering to be on its face disgraceful. When you look at some of these gerrymandered districts, that do this kind of thing in order to maximize either black votes, white votes, Republican votes, Democratic votes, I just find that to be just plain out and out chicanery, if not fraud, if not fundamentally some form of treason. I think congressional districts ought to be determined by latitude and longitude, and that any sort of playing around with neighborhoods is a violation of the spirit of the Constitution. It's a violation of the spirit of a democratic republic. If you're basically saying we're going to assign the representative for this area, but we're going to assign them just to specific neighborhoods in that area, In other words, we're going to make the districts that are voting for him confine with a particular subset of people in that general district that he's representing. Then I find that to be it's not unconstitutional because there's no law in the Constitution about it. Although I bet they would have been quite shocked at it. I just find it to be fraudulent, and I think a fundamental restructuring of congressional districts would do some good. But other than that, if it turns out that people are voting the way they want to locally based on the way things are going nationally, and as long as there's no actual legal transference of power, then that's just the freedom of the American people to do what they want to do. And I'm with that all the way.
And for you historians among us, Elbridge Gerry, a representative way back in the 1700s, which was more than 100 years ago, had a district.
You were a journalist.
Had a district that was shaped kind of like a salamander, from which we get the term gerrymandering.
His name was Gerrymander?
Elbridge Gerry, and his district looked like a salamander.
I'll be damned.
It was gerrymandered.
I did not know that.
It was a long, skinny district that kind of snaked around. So
Got it. Well done, Scott.
In the good old days, they used to say that the people pick their representatives. Of course, it has come to be the representatives pick their people. We have not picked the people who have become the supporters at BillWhittle.com. They've picked us, and we are honored by that choice. And we try every day to do the best we can to bring cogent analysis to the news of the day, anchored to time-tested principles. And that's why the people who are members at BillWhittle.com support this kind of programming. You can go to BillWhittle.com right now, even if you're not a member, and see the deep archive of programs like Bill Whittle Now. And if you wish, you can also join the ranks of our members. Try it out for a month. If you don't love it, we'll cheerfully and rapidly refund your money, but we think you're going to like it. So go to BillWhittle.com, right? Go ahead, Bill.
I'm sorry, I just have to throw this in. I just learned a word, the meaning of a word that I've been using for 20 years. I hadn't the slightest idea what it means. And that's a benefit to all of you who didn't know what a gerrymander was. Some of you did, but most of you didn't, I'll bet. That's brought to you free of charge by the members at BillWhittle.com. And I am very, very grateful to have had that experience.
And by the way, the word salamander actually comes from an Italian pizza shop where they used to put an amphibian topping on their pizzas. And it became very well known in the region. So salamander... No, that's not true. I'm sorry.
Thank God, because the idea of lizard pizza is not enough it's enough to put me off my lunch.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're grateful for the support of the members. You can hear us now on the podcast version on all your favorite podcast apps, with the exception of Stitcher, and we are in the process of getting reviewed by the folks at Stitcher. So pretty soon you'll be able to hear us not only on Podcast Addict and Apple and Google and SoundCloud, but also on Stitcher. Go to BillWhittle.com and click that podcast link. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks for watching or listening, or both.